The billionaire laughed when the poor black girl said she spoke 9 languages until she opened her mouth and shocked everyone. Hit like and subscribe so we can keep creating the stories you love. The elevator's mechanical hum cut through silence as polished steel doors slid open on the 57th floor. Richard Blackstone stepped out, his Italian leather shoes clicking against marble that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Each step echoed through the pristine hallway like a countdown timer, marking the rhythm of power moving through its domain. At 55, Richard commanded attention without effort. His silver hair was perfectly styled by a barber who charged more per visit than most people earned in a week. His charcoal Armani suit was tailored to emphasize broad shoulders that had never known real labor, cut from fabric so fine it seemed to absorb light itself. A Patek Philippe watch caught the afternoon sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, its face worth more than a luxury car. But it was his smile that truly defined Richard Blackstone. Sharp as a blade, calculating as a chess master, and tinged with the casual cruelty of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. It was the smile of a man who owned floors in the sky and looked down on the world from heights that made people look like insects. The mahogany-paneled hallway stretched before him like a corridor of conquest. Oil paintings of long-dead industrialists gazed down with approval from gilt frames. Beneath his feet, Persian rugs older than most nations muffled his footsteps as he approached the double doors of the executive boardroom. Richard paused at those doors, straightening his platinum cufflinks, a ritual that had become as automatic as breathing. Behind that threshold waited his kingdom, 20 feet of polished oak table that had hosted deals worth billions, surrounded by leather chairs soft as butter and twice as expensive. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a godlike view of Manhattan, where tiny people scurried like ants between glass towers that scraped the belly of heaven itself. Today's meeting would seal his legacy. The Lee Corporation deal represented more than money. It was validation, proof that Richard Blackstone could navigate the complexities of international business with the same ruthless efficiency that had built his empire. 18 months of negotiations, countless flights across the Pacific, armies of lawyers and consultants, all leading to this moment. He pushed open the doors with theatrical flair, his presence filling the space like expensive cologne. Gentlemen, Richard's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. Today we make history. His board of directors was already assembled, a collection of Harvard MBAs and Yale-educated sharks who had learned to read Richard's moods like weathermen studying storm clouds. They rose as one, a choreographed display of respect that never failed to please him. Jennifer Walsh, his VP of International Relations, offered a crisp nod from her position near the windows. At 42, she was sharp as a scalpel and twice as cutting when necessary. Her red hair was pulled back in a severe bun that screamed competence, her charcoal suit a perfect match for Richard's own power uniform. Tom Reeves, head of corporate development, checked his Rolex with practiced anxiety. At 38, Tom had learned to channel his nervous energy into meticulous preparation and flawless execution. His dark suit was immaculate, his presentation materials arranged with military precision. David Chun, chief financial officer, sat quietly reviewing spreadsheets that contained enough zeros to make mathematicians weep. His wire-rimmed glasses reflected columns of numbers that represented fortunes built and lost with the stroke of a pen. Marcus Webb, director of legal affairs, had positioned himself strategically near the contracts that would bind two corporate empires together. His silver beard and measured movements spoke of decades spent turning handshakes into unbreakable chains of obligation. The room itself was a temple to capitalist achievement. The oak table had been carved from a single massive tree, its surface polished to mirror perfection. Each leather chair cost more than most people's cars, imported from Italy and hand-stitched by artisans whose families had been crafting furniture for royalty since the Renaissance. Crystal water glasses caught the light like tiny prisms, casting rainbow fragments across documents worth more than small nations' GDP. The walls were lined with awards, photographs of Richard shaking hands with presidents and prime ministers, and abstract art pieces that existed primarily to demonstrate that their owner had money to burn on incomprehensible beauty. Richard moved to his chair at the head of the table, a throne, really, elevated slightly higher than the others to ensure everyone understood the hierarchy. The view from his position encompassed his entire kingdom, his loyal subjects, his conquered territories visible through the windows, and the empty chair where his prize would soon sit. "Status report," Richard commanded, settling into leather that embraced him like a lover. Jennifer consulted her tablet with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Lee's flight landed 20 minutes ago. His car should arrive within 10 minutes. All contracts have been reviewed and approved by both legal teams. We're ready to close." "Translation services?" Richard asked, though the question was mere formality. Every detail had been planned with military precision. Maria Chun was scheduled to handle interpretation. Tom replied, then hesitated. "However, she's currently in Singapore dealing with the Zhou merger crisis. We've arranged for backup translation through the usual service." Richard's smile faltered for just a moment. "Backup? Professional service? Top-rated. The interpreter should arrive with Mr. Lee." "Should." Richard's voice carried a note of displeasure that made his directors shift uncomfortably. In Richard's world, "should" was a four-letter word. Things either happened according to plan or heads rolled. But before he could express his dissatisfaction properly, his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Blackstone, Mr. Lee has arrived." Richard's smile returned, predatory and confident. "Excellent. Send him up." The next few minutes ticked by with the weight of destiny. Richard could feel the electricity in the air, the tension that always preceded his greatest triumphs. This deal would cement his reputation as a master of international commerce, a bridge builder between East and West, a visionary who could navigate the choppy waters of global business with the skill of a master mariner. The boardroom doors opened with a whisper of expensive hinges. Mr. Lee entered precisely on schedule, and Richard's first impression was of quiet dignity wrapped in conservative tailoring. At 60, the Chinese businessman moved with the careful precision of old money, each step measured and deliberate. His dark suit was expensive but understated, the kind of quality that whispered rather than shouted its cost. Silver temples framed a face lined with decades of hard-won experience, eyes that had seen empires rise and fall with the patience of someone who understood that true power was built slowly, brick by brick, decision by careful decision. But Richard noticed immediately what was missing. No interpreter followed in Mr. Lee's wake. "Mr. Lee," Richard rose from his throne, extending a hand that had closed deals worth billions. "Welcome to Blackstone Industries. I trust your flight was comfortable." Mr. Lee accepted the handshake with a slight bow, his grip firm but not aggressive. When he spoke, his English was careful, each word selected with deliberate precision. "Thank you for welcoming. Flight was long but good." A small silence followed, heavy with implications. Richard's smile maintained its wattage, but behind his eyes, calculations were already being adjusted. "Please sit." Richard gestured to the chair across from his own, the supplicant's position, though he would never phrase it that way. "Can I offer you something to drink? Water, coffee, perhaps something stronger?" Mr. Lee settled into the leather with obvious appreciation for its quality. "Water, please." "Thank you." Richard nodded to Jennifer, who moved with practiced efficiency to pour crystal glasses of imported spring water. The sound of liquid meeting glass seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly tense atmosphere. "I trust your hotel accommodations are satisfactory," Richard continued, following the script of corporate hospitality while his mind raced through contingency plans. "Yes, very good. Thank you for arrangements." Mr. Lee's pause before arrangements stretched just long enough to suggest he was translating in real time. Richard glanced at his directors, each micro-expression a communication in the unspoken language of executive hierarchy. Tom's jaw was slightly tighter than usual. Jennifer's fingers drummed once against her tablet, a nervous tell she'd never quite conquered. David's glasses reflected the afternoon sun as he adjusted them with surgical precision. "Excellent," Richard said, his voice carrying false heartiness. "Then let's discuss the future of our partnership." He reached for the contract stack with theatrical flair, documents bound in leather folders that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "As you can see, we've prepared everything according to our previous discussions. Section 1 outlines the initial investment structure." Mr. Lee leaned forward, studying the documents with obvious intelligence. But when Richard began explaining the intricacies of the deal, The first cracks in the facade began to show. The quarterly assessment protocols, Richard was saying, his voice taking on the cadence of a professor addressing particularly slow students, ensure maximum transparency in our operational methodology. Mr. Lee's brow furrowed. He held up a hand politely. Quarterly assessment protocols? The pause that followed was loaded with implications. Richard felt his smile tighten almost imperceptibly. Quarterly means every 3 months, Richard explained, his tone growing fractionally sharper. Assessment refers to evaluation. Protocols are the procedures we follow. Mr. Lee nodded slowly, but confusion still clouded his features like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. He pulled out his smartphone, an expensive model, but clearly unfamiliar in his hands. Perhaps, I use Translate application, he said apologetically. Richard's directors exchanged glances that spoke volumes. This was not the smooth, professional negotiation they had rehearsed in their minds. Of course, Richard said, though his teeth were slightly clenched. Whatever makes you comfortable. Mr. Lee typed slowly with one finger, his face a study in concentration. The translation app's mechanical voice filled the boardroom like a broken radio. Time period 3 months evaluation method following steps. The silence that followed was pregnant with awkward tension. Jennifer Walsh coughed delicately, a sound that might have been suppressing laughter or horror. It was impossible to tell which. I believe, Jennifer ventured carefully. Mr. Lee is asking about our evaluation methods for 3-month periods. Ah, yes. Mr. Lee's face lit up with relief that was almost painful to witness. Evaluation methods. Yes, this is concern for me. Richard felt the first stirrings of genuine frustration. This was supposed to be his moment of triumph, not a comedy of errors performed for an audience of expensive suits and crystal glasses. Our evaluation methods, Richard began, speaking slowly as if addressing a child, involve comprehensive analysis of performance metrics, stakeholder satisfaction indices, and ROI optimization frameworks. Each technical term hit Mr. Lee like a small physical blow. His confusion deepened with every syllable, and he returned to his phone with increasing desperation. The translation app mangled the complex business terminology into digital gibberish. Complete analysis, performing measurements, interested party happy numbers, money back, improvement structures. Mr. Lee stared at his phone screen as if it had betrayed him personally. Around the table, Richard's directors were performing elaborate studies of their own hands, the ceiling, their water glasses, anywhere but the increasingly uncomfortable scene unfolding before them. Perhaps, Tom Reeves suggested with diplomatic delicacy, we could simplify the technical language. Richard's smile had become a mask stretched over growing irritation. Simplify. The word tasted bitter on his tongue. This deal was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, involving complex international frameworks that required precision, not kindergarten explanations. But he tried. For the next 20 minutes, Richard attempted to explain advanced corporate structures using words a child might understand. The result was a disaster of patronizing oversimplification that satisfied no one. Risk management, Richard was saying with exaggerated patience, means we protect against bad things happening to the business. Mr. Lee typed frantically into his phone. The app responded, danger control means we safety guard against bad things occurring business. The circular redundancy was maddening. Richard felt his professional composure cracking like ice under pressure. Market volatility assessment, he continued, his voice strained, involves studying how prices go up and down. More typing. More mechanical translation. Market shake study involves learning how money costs rise/fall. Mr. Lee spoke rapidly in Mandarin, clearly frustrated. The sounds were beautiful, musical, complex, intelligent, but they might as well have been signals from Mars for all the comprehension they generated in the boardroom. Richard caught fragments, Fengxian and Pingu and Zhanliue, words that danced through the air with linguistic grace but landed in his mind like stones in deep water, sinking without meaning. I'm afraid, Richard said with forced politeness, I don't speak Mandarin. Mr. Lee switched back to English, his voice carrying unmistakable frustration. Risk evaluation, very important for my company. Must understand. Strategy 4-4. He gestured helplessly, searching for words that existed in his mind but not on his tongue. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Richard could feel his carefully planned timeline disintegrating. What should have been a 30-minute presentation was approaching an hour with no resolution in sight. Jennifer Walsh leaned toward Richard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, perhaps we should contact the translation service directly? Find out what happened to." "The translator was supposed to be here," Richard interrupted, his voice carrying the edge of a man whose patience was being tested beyond reasonable limits. Tom Reeves consulted his phone with nervous efficiency. "I'm calling the service now." While Tom spoke in hushed tones to someone on the other end, Richard found himself staring at Mr. Lee with growing frustration. Here was a man obviously intelligent. You don't build a multi-billion-dollar empire without brains, but reduced to hunting and pecking on a translation app like a confused tourist. The irony was bitter. Richard prided himself on his international sophistication, his ability to navigate global markets with cosmopolitan ease. He'd closed deals in London, Tokyo, Dubai, Sao Paulo. He spoke what he considered business English, the lingua franca of modern commerce, and had always assumed that was sufficient. But watching Mr. Lee struggle with technical terminology, seeing intelligence trapped behind language barriers, Richard felt something ugly stirring in his chest. Not empathy. That would require seeing Mr. Lee as a fellow human being facing a challenge. Instead, Richard felt the familiar irritation of a man accustomed to efficiency watching inefficiency unfold in real time. "The translator," Tom reported, covering his phone, "had a family emergency. They're sending a replacement, but it will be at least an hour." An hour. Richard's jaw tightened. His afternoon was scheduled down to the minute, every appointment choreographed like a ballet of productivity. An hour delay would cascade through his entire week like dominoes falling. "This is..." Richard began, then caught himself. Professional facade intact, he tried again. "This is certainly unexpected." But Mr. Lee had heard the tone beneath the words. His face tightened with what might have been embarrassment or anger. It was impossible to tell which. Richard made a decision that would haunt him within minutes. Instead of patience, instead of understanding, instead of the basic human decency that should govern interactions between intelligent people facing communication challenges, he chose frustration. "You know," Richard said, his smile returning but colder now, like winter sunlight on ice, "sometimes I forget how challenging these international partnerships can be." His directors recognized the shift in their boss's mood. Jennifer's pen stopped moving. Tom slowly closed his phone. David's glasses reflected the afternoon sun as he adjusted them with surgical precision, a nervous tell as reliable as sunrise. "Language barriers and all that," Richard continued, his voice loud enough to carry across the boardroom, addressing his directors now rather than their client. "It's remarkable, really. Here we are, trying to conduct 21st-century business, and we're stumbling over something as basic as communication." Mr. Lee didn't understand the specific words, but the tone was universal. His face flushed with barely controlled emotion. Anger, certainly, but also something deeper. Humiliation, perhaps, or the particular sting that comes from being patronized by someone who mistakes their privilege for superiority. "I mean," Richard said, warming to his theme like a comedian who's found his rhythm, "you'd think with all the money we spend on international consultants and cultural sensitivity training, we could have a simple conversation without playing charades." Nervous laughter from around the table. Jennifer Walsh smiled tightly, the expression of someone laughing at their boss's joke because their mortgage depended on it. Tom Reeves chuckled with the enthusiasm of a man who understood which way the wind was blowing. Richard leaned back in his throne, his confidence returning as he fed off his audience's response. "It's fascinating, really. The complexities of global commerce. The challenges of cross-cultural communication." The words were becoming a performance now, Richard playing to his directors like an actor commanding a stage. Mr. Lee was no longer a potential partner. He'd become a prop in Richard's demonstration of wit and wisdom. "These foreigners," Richard said with a theatrical sigh that carried across the room like poison gas, "certainly know how to complicate simple things." The phrase landed in the boardroom like a bomb. Mr. Lee understood those words perfectly. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, disgust, before settling into the kind of controlled fury that only comes from decades of dealing with casual racism disguised as sophisticated observation. But Richard was oblivious to the damage he'd just inflicted, or perhaps he simply didn't care. The laughter from his directors was like applause, validation that he'd successfully transformed an embarrassing situation into entertaining commentary on the challenges of international business. He was still chuckling when the boardroom door opened with a soft whisper of expensive hinges. Rosa Martinez entered carrying a spray bottle of industrial cleaner and a cloth worn soft by thousands of hours of use. At 38, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself invisible in the presence of power. Her uniform was faded but spotless, pressed with the kind of care that comes from having only one good set of work clothes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail secured with a rubber band that had seen better days, and her hands bore the calluses and small scars that come from years of honest labor. She paused in the doorway, her eyes taking in the scene with the quick assessment of someone who cleaned up after these people daily. The tension in the room was thick as fog, and Rosa's practiced eye caught the subtle signs. Mr. Lee's rigid posture, Richard's false smile, the director's uncomfortable body language. Behind her, trying to match her mother's careful steps, walked a small figure that didn't belong in this world of power and privilege. Nia was 10 years old, with deep brown skin that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her curious eyes moved across the room with the kind of intelligent observation that most adults had forgotten how to practice. She saw everything. The expensive art on the walls, the crystal glasses catching light like prisms, the way the adults sat in their chairs like actors playing roles they'd rehearsed but never quite believed in. Her curly hair was tied in neat pigtails with yellow ribbon that had been carefully preserved through multiple washings. The ribbon matched her simple dress, which had once been bright sunshine yellow but had faded through dozens of trips through Rose's ancient washing machine to the color of pale morning light. The dress was clean and pressed, mended in several places with stitches so small and careful they were almost invisible. Testimony to Rose's skill with a needle and her determination that her daughter would always look presentable, regardless of their circumstances. Nia's shoes were clearly hand-me-downs, scuffed black Mary Janes that had probably belonged to several other girls before finding their way to her feet. But they were polished to a mirror shine, the leather cared for with the kind of attention that comes from knowing you might not get another pair soon. Richard's attention shifted to this unexpected interruption like a predator focusing on new prey. "Excuse me." The question carried authority, amusement, and just a hint of irritation. Rosa froze like a deer in headlights, her face immediately flushing with the kind of embarrassment that comes from being noticed when you've spent your life trying to remain invisible. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Blackstone," Rosa said, her voice barely above a whisper. She clutched her cleaning supplies like a shield, knuckles white with tension. "The daycare. There was an emergency today. A water pipe burst, and they had to close. I had no one to watch her." Richard's eyebrows rose with theatrical surprise. "I see. And you thought a corporate board meeting was an appropriate daycare solution?" "No, sir. Absolutely not, sir." Rose's voice carried the particular strain of someone who has practiced apologizing to authority figures until it became a reflex. "She'll wait outside in the hallway. Very quiet. She has a book. I'm so sorry, I'll just—" "No, no," Richard interrupted, his mood brightening as he sensed an opportunity for entertainment that might salvage his damaged afternoon. "This is interesting. Bring your daughter to work day." His directors laughed with the enthusiasm of people who understood their boss's moods and adjusted their responses accordingly. Tom Reeves grinned widely, sensing safe ground. "I don't think that's until next month, Richard." "Even better," Richard said, his smile becoming genuine for the first time in an hour. The presence of this small intruder had shifted the room's energy, providing a distraction from the communication disaster that had been unfolding around the contract table. He gestured grandly toward Nia, who was studying the assembled adults with the kind of quiet intelligence that made some people uncomfortable. "Please, young lady, come forward. Don't be shy." Rosa's hand tightened protectively on her daughter's shoulder. "Nia, please, we should go." But Richard was enjoying himself now, his confidence returning as he sensed an audience for his performance. "Nonsense. I'm curious about our youngest consultant's perspective on international business negotiations." More laughter from around the table. Jennifer Walsh covered her mouth with her hand, trying to appear professional while clearly enjoying the absurdity of the moment. The tension that had been building around the failed communication with Mr. Lee was dissipating, replaced by the kind of patronizing amusement that powerful people feel when children wander into their adult spaces. "Tell me, young lady," Richard continued, his voice taking on the artificially cheerful tone adults use when addressing children they find amusing. "What's your name?" Nia looked at her mother, who nodded reluctantly. "Nia Martinez, sir." "Nia Martinez." Richard repeated the name with exaggerated formality, as if he were announcing her at a state dinner. "Well, Miss Martinez, we're having a small communication challenge here today." He gestured toward the confused Mr. Lee with the kind of theatrical flair usually reserved for game show hosts. "Perhaps you have some insights into the complexities of international commerce?" The laughter that followed was louder now, fueled by relief at having found something amusing in what had been shaping up as a professional disaster. Tom Reeves actually slapped his knee, delighted by his boss's wit. Rose's face burned with shame so intense it was almost physical. She tugged gently at Nia's arm. "Nia, please, we need to go outside." But Nia was studying the scene with those sharp, curious eyes that seemed to see more than they should. She'd caught the undertone in Richard's voice when he'd spoken about these foreigners. She'd seen the way Mr. Lee's shoulders had tensed, the way his hands had clenched slightly at sides. She recognized the dynamics at play because she'd lived them herself. The casual dismissal, the assumption that being different meant being lesser, the way powerful people sometimes found entertainment in other people's struggles. Most 10-year-olds would have been intimidated by the expensive suits, the crystal glasses, the air of importance that hung over the room like expensive cologne. But Nia had spent her life in the spaces between worlds, the hotel lobbies where her mother worked night shifts, the hospital corridors where she'd sat quietly while Rosa cleaned rooms, the library where she'd learned that knowledge was free to anyone hungry enough to seek it. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady, carrying the kind of clarity that comes from children who've been forced to grow up faster than they should. "I can help." The words landed in the middle of the boardroom like a small explosion. Richard's laughter bubbled up from somewhere deep in his chest, genuine and delighted. "Oh, this is perfect," he gasped, turning to his directors with the expression of someone who'd just witnessed the funniest thing imaginable. "Did you hear that? Our youngest consultant thinks she can solve our international communication crisis." The laughter that followed was explosive, feeding on itself as it bounced around the room. Tom Reeves doubled over, his professional composure completely abandoned. Jennifer Walsh was shaking with suppressed giggles, her hand pressed firmly over her mouth. Even David Chun, normally the most reserved member of the team, was chuckling behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "By all means, little consultant," Richard said when he'd recovered enough to speak. "Please share your professional expertise with us. How exactly do you propose to solve our language barrier problem?" Around the table, his directors were wiping tears from their eyes, enjoying the best entertainment they'd had in months. The expensive crystal glasses seemed to catch and amplify their laughter, turning it into a symphony of sophisticated amusement. But Nia didn't flinch. Despite being the smallest person in a room full of titans, despite the laughter echoing off marble walls and crystal surfaces, something in her posture commanded attention. Her spine straightened with dignity that seemed impossible in someone so young, and her eyes held a steadiness that made several of the adults shift uncomfortably in their leather chairs. "I speak 9 languages," she said simply. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Then the boardroom exploded with laughter so intense it seemed to shake the floor-to-ceiling windows. Richard threw his head back, genuinely entertained for the first time all day. 9 languages," he repeated, his voice carrying across the room like a ringmaster announcing the circus's star act. "Did you hear that, gentlemen? 9 languages." Tom Reeves slapped the polished oak table with enough force to make the crystal glasses ring like bells. "That's incredible. And here we are, paying Maria Chun 6 figures to handle our international relations." Jennifer Walsh was gasping for breath between giggles. 9 languages. From a 10-year-old. Even Mr. Lee, despite not understanding the English conversation, seemed to sense he was part of some elaborate joke. His expression grew darker, more closed off, as he watched the entertainment unfold around him. Richard wiped tears from his eyes with a handkerchief that probably cost more than Rose's monthly salary. This is absolutely delicious. Young lady, please enlighten us. Which 9 languages would those be? I'm dying to know. His voice dripped with theatrical amazement, the tone of someone indulging a child's fantasy while simultaneously mocking it. Around the table, his directors leaned forward with exaggerated attention, ready to enjoy whatever innocent delusion was about to unfold. Nia looked directly at Richard, her voice clear and unwavering. English, Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, French, Arabic, Portuguese, German, Italian, and Japanese. The laughter reached a crescendo that seemed to threaten the structural integrity of the crystal chandelier hanging over the conference table. Richard clutched his chest in mock amazement. Mandarin Chinese, he gasped between bursts of laughter. Oh, this is too perfect. You speak Mandarin Chinese. Well then, problem solved. He gestured toward the increasingly uncomfortable Mr. Lee. Our distinguished guest and our youngest consultant can have a lovely chat. The mockery was so thick it was almost visible, hanging in the air like smoke. Tom Rees was practically crying with laughter. Richard, this is perfect. We should put her on the payroll. Absolutely. Richard agreed, his voice carrying the false enthusiasm of someone playing to an appreciative audience. Miss Martinez, please approach our esteemed guest and demonstrate your linguistic prowess. Ask Mr. Lee about his concerns regarding quarterly risk assessment protocols. More snickers rippled around the table. The adults were enjoying themselves immensely, watching what they assumed would be a harmless display of childish imagination. Rose's face had gone beyond embarrassment into something approaching anguish. She tugged more insistently at her daughter's arm. Nia, please, we need to leave. Now. But Mr. Lee had been watching this exchange with growing disgust. Even without understanding every word, he could read the body language, the tone, the casual cruelty of powerful people entertaining themselves at the expense of a child and her working mother. His jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth, and his hands were gripped into fists in his lap. Richard was still chuckling when he made his final challenge. Go ahead, sweetheart. Show us how you speak Chinese to the nice businessman. I'm sure he'll be very impressed. The condescension in his voice was so thick, it was almost pornographic. He was performing now, putting on a show for his director's entertainment, turning a child's claim into a source of sophisticated amusement. But Nia had reached her limit. She'd watched Mr. Lee's dignity being trampled. She'd seen her mother's face burn with shame. She'd heard the casual cruelty in Richard's voice when he dismissed these foreigners, and she'd recognized it as the same tone she'd heard countless times when people looked at her and her mother and saw only what they expected to see. Invisibility, irrelevance, people who didn't matter enough to treat with basic human decency. Nia looked at her mother one more time. Rose's eyes pleaded with her to stay quiet, to not make things worse, to preserve what little dignity they had left in this room full of people who saw them as entertainment. But Nia could see Mr. Lee sitting in his expensive suit, reduced to playing with a translation app like a confused tourist, his intelligence and accomplishments dismissed by people who'd never built anything themselves, only inherited or stumbled into their positions of power. She made a decision that would change everything. The movement was small but decisive, like a chess piece claiming its square. She stepped forward, away from her mother's protective hand, away from the safety of invisibility, directly into the spotlight of the most powerful people in the room. The laughter began to fade as something shifted in the boardroom's energy. It was subtle at first, a change in posture, a quality of attention that suggested the joke might be about to become something else entirely. Nia turned to face Mr. Lee directly. She looked into his eyes with the kind of respect that the adults in the room had forgotten how to show, and when she spoke, her voice carried a precision that seemed impossible in someone so young. Li Xianxing, she began, her pronunciation crisp and respectful. Qing Yuanliang Temin de Wuli. Wajidao Zhidue Nin Lai Shuahan Lingren Juzang. The words flowed from her lips like music, each syllable perfectly formed, carrying tones and inflections that spoke of real understanding, not phrasebook memorization. The silence that followed was absolute, complete, the kind of silence that falls when the world suddenly stops making sense. Mr. Lee's eyes widened with shock so profound it was almost comical. His mouth fell open slightly, and for a moment he seemed frozen, as if his brain was struggling to process what he'd just heard. Then his face transformed. The frustration and anger that had been building for the past hour melted away, replaced by relief so intense it was almost painful to witness. He leaned forward in his chair, his entire body language changing from defensive to engaged. Xiaopingyo, he said, his voice filled with wonder. Nijin de hui shua zhongwen ma? Je bukasi da. Around the conference table, Richard's directors had gone completely silent. Tom Reeves' mouth was hanging open. Jennifer Walsh had frozen with her pen halfway to her notepad. David Chin's glasses had slipped slightly down his nose, and he made no move to adjust them. Richard himself looked like he'd been struck by lightning. His face had gone completely blank, the confident smirk wiped away as if it had never existed. Nia nodded to Mr. Lee with the kind of formal respect that spoke of real cultural understanding. Sure da, Xianxing. Was Xueshi Zhongwen Hen Duanyin Lo. Qinggaosu Wanin Due Hatong de Danxin. Mr. Lee's response came in rapid, excited Mandarin. Was Zue Danxin de Shi Fengxian Pingu de Pinlu Hafangfa. Tamin Tan Dao de Jidu Pingu, Wabuming Bai Je Shi Fo Baokwa Huobi Bodong Finchi. The conversation flowed between them like a river, finding its natural course. Mr. Lee's relief was palpable as he finally had someone who could understand not just his words, but the sophisticated concepts behind them. Nia listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions in perfect Mandarin, her small face serious with concentration. Then she turned back to the stunned boardroom, her voice clear and professional. Mr. Lee is primarily concerned about the frequency and methodology of risk assessments mentioned in Section 12 of the contract. He wants to understand whether the quarterly evaluations will include comprehensive currency fluctuation analysis and whether your company has established protocols for political instability in emerging markets that could affect supply chain logistics. The words hung in the air like an impossibility made manifest. Every phrase was precise, technical, demonstrating not just language ability, but deep understanding of complex business concepts. Richard's world was tilting on its axis. This was impossible. She was 10 years old, the daughter of a janitor. She was supposed to be invisible, irrelevant, nothing more than an amusing interruption to his important day. But Mr. Lee wasn't finished. The relief of finally being understood had opened floodgates, and he continued in rapid Mandarin. Hai yo, guan yu di shi, tiao quan zhong ti dao de gong ing lian fengxian. Wadanxin zanggang, ha xinjiapo de gong ko wulio kining zhaoqing pingjing. Ing xiang jiaofu jihua. Nia nodded thoughtfully, processing the complex logistics terminology with the ease of someone who'd spent years absorbing business conversations in multiple languages. She turned back to the boardroom, her translation seamless and professional. Mr. Lee is also concerned about supply chain risks mentioned in Section 12. Specifically, he's worried that your current port logistics strategy, which routes primarily through Hong Kong and Singapore, could create bottlenecks that would impact delivery schedules during peak seasons or political tensions. Tom Reeves' pen had fallen from his nerveless fingers. Jennifer Walsh was staring at Nia as if she'd just performed actual magic. The technical precision of the translation was beyond what most professional interpreters could manage, delivered by a 10-year-old girl in a faded yellow dress. Richard tried to speak, but no sound came out. His throat felt like sandpaper, his carefully constructed world cracking apart like ice in spring thaw. Mr. Lee continued, his confidence growing with each successfully communicated concept. Wahai shang liaojitamen de yesji jingsa. Tb shi zai huanjing kechiksu, xingfamian de china. Zhidue women zai ojo de huzwa huoban henjongyao. He's asking about your ESG policies. Nia translated without missing a beat, particularly environmental sustainability commitments. This is crucial for his European partnerships, which have strict compliance requirements for their supply chain partners. David Chin finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. How? How does she know about ESG compliance frameworks? But Nia wasn't finished demonstrating her linguistic range. She turned to Mr. Lee and switched effortlessly to another language entirely. Monsieur Lee, concernant les réglementations européennes don't vous parlez. Puisque, clarifier si vous faites référence aux directives de l'Union européenne sur la responsabilité sociale des entreprises? Mr. Lee's face lit up with delight. Ah, vous parlez français aussi. Oui, exactement. Mes partenaires français exigent unconformit strict. The conversation flowed seamlessly between French and Mandarin, with Nia switching languages like a conductor directing an orchestra. She translated complex European regulatory requirements, explained nuanced legal frameworks, and clarified technical specifications with the precision of someone who'd spent years studying international business practices. He confirms, Nia said, returning to English, that his French partners require strict compliance with EU corporate responsibility directives. He needs written assurance that your company can meet these standards, particularly regarding carbon footprint reporting and ethical sourcing verification. Richard's directors were no longer looking at Nia as an amusing child who'd wandered into their adult space. They were staring at her with the kind of shocked respect usually reserved for visiting dignitaries or Nobel Prize winners. But Nia still wasn't finished. Mr. Lee mentioned something about Middle Eastern partnerships, and she switched to Arabic with the same fluid precision. Sayedli, by ko ash sharakat fi ash shark alasa, haltukat ash sharakat ma alimarat wasiyadiya? The Arabic flowed from her young voice like poetry, each syllable perfectly formed with the kind of pronunciation that spoke of deep cultural understanding, not classroom memorization. Mr. Lee responded with obvious admiration. And Jennifer Walsh had stopped trying to take notes. Her pen lay forgotten on the polished oak table as she watched a 10-year-old conduct high-level international business negotiations in languages most Harvard MBAs couldn't pronounce, let alone speak fluently. Mr. Lee confirms his partnerships in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, Nia translated. He emphasizes that these relationships require deep cultural understanding and sensitivity to local business practices. He's impressed that someone so young can navigate these cultural nuances. Tom Reeves was shaking his head slowly, like a man trying to wake up from a dream that made no sense. This is impossible. She's 10 years old. Richard found his voice at last, though it came out cracked and hoarse. How? How do you? But before he could finish the question, Mr. Lee was speaking again, this time in rapid Japanese. Kono ko wahantoni sugoi desu. Watashi no neon no patonatachi mo kiddo odoroka desho. Without hesitation, Nia responded in equally fluent Japanese. Arigato gozaimasu, Lee-san. Neon no bijaniza bunka and itsut mo sukashi shida mesu. The conversation continued in Japanese for several minutes, covering complex topics about manufacturing standards, quality control protocols, and the particular business etiquette required for successful partnerships in Tokyo and Osaka. Mr. Lee is explaining, Nia said, switching back to English, that his Japanese partners have very specific requirements for manufacturing quality control. He needs assurance that your production facilities can meet Six Sigma standards and that your quality assurance team understands the Japanese concept of Kaizen, continuous improvement. Marcus Webb, who had been silent throughout the entire meeting, finally spoke. Six Sigma, Kaizen. These are advanced manufacturing concepts. How does a child? He trailed off, unable to finish the question because the answer was sitting right in front of him, speaking with the authority of someone who clearly understood every word she was translating. Richard was staring at Nia as if she were an alien artifact, something that couldn't possibly exist but was undeniably real. His entire worldview was collapsing in real time. Everything he believed about intelligence, about worth, about the natural order of society, was being systematically demolished by a 10-year-old girl in hand-me-down shoes. Mr. Lee stood up from his chair, his face transformed with amazement and gratitude. He looked at Nia with the kind of respect usually reserved for brilliant colleagues or honored elders. Xiao Laoshi, he said formally in Mandarin, Nin Shirwa Jinghua Dezui Yoshio Du Yuan. Nin De Caihua Lingren Jingtan. Mr. Lee is calling me little teacher, Nia translated, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. He says I'm the most skilled interpreter he's ever worked with. He's amazed by my abilities. Richard's throat felt like he'd been swallowing ground glass. This was impossible. This couldn't be happening. She was the daughter of a cleaning woman. She lived in whatever neighborhood people like her lived in, attended whatever schools people like her attended, had access to whatever resources people like her could afford. But the evidence was undeniable. For the past 20 minutes, he'd watched a 10-year-old conduct sophisticated international business negotiations in multiple languages, demonstrating knowledge of complex regulatory frameworks, cultural nuances, and technical specifications that most of his highly paid consultants struggled to understand. Mr. Li continued speaking, his voice filled with emotion. 我想修正我的突击决定。如果是家公司能人识到真正的才华，不管他来自哪里。He wants to revise his investment decision, Nia translated, her voice carrying new confidence as she saw the adults around the table beginning to treat her with genuine respect. He's prepared to increase his financial commitment to your company by 40%. The number hit the boardroom like a physical force. 40%. That represented hundreds of millions of dollars, more money than some countries' entire GDP. Richard's mouth fell open. 40%. Mr. Li nodded enthusiastically, then continued in Mandarin. Dan wei you一个条件。这家公司必须认识清楚运用才华和智慧。不论他来自什么背景。Nia's translation was precise and unwavering. But he has one condition. He requires a formal commitment from your company to value talent and intelligence regardless of age, background, or social position. The words landed in the room like hammer blows. Around the table, Richard's directors were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't just a display of linguistic ability. It was a complete reversal of power dynamics, a 10-year-old rewriting the rules of their carefully ordered corporate world. Mr. Li gestured toward Nia with obvious admiration, speaking in formal Mandarin. 这ji xiao nu shi xiang, 我生命lu cai hua qi, zai renha di fong bei fa xian. Ta de nungli bi naiman guyong, de zue ongue de zhuanya ren yuan do qiang. Mr. Li says, Nia translated, her voice growing stronger with each word, that I've proven talent can be found anywhere. He believes my abilities exceed those of your most expensive professional consultants. Richard felt like he was drowning in open air. The 10-year-old girl standing before him had just saved his company while simultaneously destroying every assumption he'd built his life around. She'd taken what should have been a disaster and transformed it into the greatest business triumph of his career, all while exposing the ugly reality of his casual prejudices. Mr. Li wasn't finished. He looked directly at Richard, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. 我希望着家公司能学到今天的教训。真正的价值不在于财富或地位，而在于品质和能力。Nia's translation was delivered with quiet dignity. He hopes your company can learn from today's lesson. True value isn't determined by wealth or position, but by character and ability. The silence that followed was profound, loaded with implications that would reshape everything about how these people understood their world. Tom Reeves was the first to find his voice. Nia, that was incredible. Truly incredible. I've never seen anything like it. Jennifer Walsh nodded vigorously, her professional composure completely abandoned. The way you handled those technical terms, the cultural nuances, it was masterful. David Chun was studying Nia with the kind of analytical respect he usually reserved for complex financial models. Your understanding of international regulatory frameworks is extraordinary. How did you acquire such specialized knowledge? But all eyes eventually turned to Richard, waiting to see how the man who'd spent the afternoon mocking this child would respond to having his world turned upside down. Richard stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. The room watched as he walked around the massive oak table, each step echoing in the silence like a countdown to judgment. He stopped in front of Nia, this small girl who had just taught him the most humbling lesson of his 55 years on Earth. When he spoke, his voice was barely recognizable, cracked with emotion he didn't know how to process. Nia, he began, then stopped, struggling to find words adequate to the moment. I owe you an apology. A profound, heartfelt apology. Rosa moved to stand beside her daughter, tears streaming down her face as she watched her child command the respect of some of the most powerful people in the city. Richard continued, his voice growing stronger as he found the courage to face the magnitude of his mistake. I was wrong. About you, about your mother, about everything that happened here today. I let my prejudices blind me to something extraordinary. He looked around the boardroom, addressing his directors as much as Nia. You just saved this company. You took what should have been a complete disaster and turned it into our greatest success of the year. And you did it with intelligence, professionalism, and more dignity than I showed in my own boardroom. The words felt like they were being pulled from somewhere deep in his chest, each one a recognition of how badly he'd misjudged not just Nia, but probably countless other people throughout his life. You demonstrated abilities that most adults never develop, Richard continued. You showed cultural sensitivity that our highest-paid consultants struggle to achieve. You conducted business negotiations in multiple languages with the skill of someone with decades of experience. He paused, looking directly into Nia's steady, intelligent eyes. But more than that, you showed kindness. When Mr. Lee was struggling, when he was being mocked and dismissed, you stepped forward to help. That speaks to character that can't be taught in any business school. Around the table, his directors were nodding in agreement, their faces reflecting a mixture of amazement and shame at how they'd participated in the earlier mockery. Richard's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Thank you, Nia. Thank you for saving our deal. Thank you for showing us what real talent looks like. And thank you for demonstrating grace under pressure that I can only hope to emulate. Mr. Lee, who had been watching this exchange with obvious approval, stood and began to applaud. The sound started slowly, a single pair of hands clapping with deliberate respect. Jennifer Walsh joined in, then Tom Reeves, then David Chun and Marcus Webb. Soon the entire boardroom was filled with the sound of genuine applause, not the performative clapping of corporate theater, but real appreciation for something extraordinary they'd just witnessed. But the applause meant something more than recognition of Nia's linguistic abilities. It was acknowledgement of a fundamental shift in how they understood worth and value. It was recognition that intelligence and talent could come from anywhere, wrapped in any package, speaking with any accent. Rosa wrapped her arm around Nia's shoulders, her own tears falling freely as she watched her daughter receive the recognition she'd always known she deserved but had never dared hope she'd get. As the applause continued, Richard found himself clapping too, for a 10-year-old girl who had just rewritten his understanding of what excellence looked like. She'd shown him that the most expensive education money could buy was no match for curiosity, determination, and the kind of open-hearted intelligence that saw communication barriers not as obstacles, but as bridges waiting to be built. The afternoon sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting new patterns of light across the polished oak table where contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars lay signed and sealed. But the real transformation had nothing to do with money and everything to do with recognition. Mr. Lee approached Nia with the formal respect of one professional acknowledging another. Xiao Laosher, he said, bowing slightly. Was Shiwang Yo Tian Nin Koi Wei Wu de Gongxi Gongzhua. Nin de Cai Hua Taijin Gue Lo. Nia's translation carried quiet pride. He hopes that someday I might work for his company. He says my talents are too valuable to waste. Richard watched this exchange with emotions he couldn't quite name. Pride, certainly, at being associated with such remarkable talent. Shame at how close he'd come to missing it entirely. But also something deeper, a fundamental realignment of how he understood human worth. Nia, Richard said, his voice carrying new respect, Mr. Lee is right. Your abilities are remarkable. If you ever decide to pursue international business, I hope you'll consider Blackstone Industries. Tom Reeves nodded enthusiastically. We could use someone with your skills in our international division. Jennifer Walsh was already making notes. We should establish a scholarship program. There might be other students like Nia who need opportunities to develop their gifts. But Nia's response was characteristically thoughtful. Thank you, Mr. Blackstone. But right now, I just want to help people understand each other better. Language should bring people together, not keep them apart. The simple wisdom of her words hit the room like a revelation. In all their sophisticated business analysis, in all their complex negotiation strategies, they'd lost sight of something fundamental that a 10-year-old understood instinctively. Business was about human connection, about building bridges between different worlds. As the meeting finally began to wind down, as contracts were gathered and business cards exchanged, Richard found himself looking at Rosa with new eyes as well. This woman who cleaned their offices had raised a daughter with extraordinary gifts. What other talents were walking through his building every day? Invisible to him because he'd learned to see only what he expected to see. Mr. Lee gathered his papers, shook hands with everyone around the table, and then turned to Nia one final time. Xie Xiani, Xiao Lao Shi. Nige Luwa Iga Hun Da De Li Wu. He's thanking me, Nia translated. He says I gave him a great gift. No, Richard said quietly, watching the scene unfold. You gave all of us a gift. You showed us what we'd been missing. As Nia and Rosa prepared to leave, as Mr. Lee headed for the elevator with his signed contracts, as Richard's directors began discussing how to restructure their international relations department, the 57th floor felt different somehow. Less like a fortress of privilege and more like what it should have been all along. A place where good ideas mattered more than expensive suits, where intelligence was valued regardless of its packaging, where the best solution won no matter who proposed it. The elevator doors closed on the sound of Richard's humbled voice asking Jennifer to schedule a meeting about educational partnerships with local schools. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread out below like a vast ocean of possibility, full of hidden talents waiting to be discovered by those wise enough to look beyond their assumptions. In the space of 2 hours, a 10-year-old girl in a faded yellow dress had spoken 9 languages, negotiated a multi-million-dollar deal, and taught a roomful of powerful adults that true worth isn't measured by wealth or position, but by the courage to step forward when someone needs help and the wisdom to build bridges where others see only walls. The most expensive education money could buy had been thoroughly outclassed by curiosity, kindness, and the revolutionary act of being exactly who you are, speaking your truth in whatever language the moment demands. As the afternoon sun painted the boardroom in shades of gold and possibility, Richard Blackstone learned that sometimes the most profound lessons come from the most unexpected teachers, wrapped in yellow ribbon and delivered with the precision of truth itself. The sound of applause had faded, but its echo would resonate in that boardroom, in those hearts, and in the decisions yet to be made for years to come. Because sometimes, just sometimes, one small voice speaking 9 languages can change everything about how we see the world and our place in it. And in that moment of recognition, as power bowed to talent and prejudice gave way to possibility, the 57th floor became exactly what it should have always been. Not a throne room, but a meeting place where the best of human potential could finally, truly, be heard. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.